this all sounds like James Bond,
Yeah.
like, villains in a room plotting into the world kind of situation. I don't know that it's exactly like that. I mean, I liked the term Ed Dowd used on the show as a meta fraud, that when you have broken incentives,
Ooh.
people just start to do fucked up things. Like,
That is
without
a good phrase.
It's not even conscious necessarily. It's they're just following their incentives, but the incentives happen to be, incentive traps, or creating these perverse outcomes as you've described. What do you think, if I could even state it like this? Obviously, BlackRock is a very large organization. Does it have and I'm just picking on BlackRock. You go all three, whichever one. Does it have a goal? Like, is there a goal here, or is this just a bunch of goals that are manifesting in perverse outcomes? Like, what do you think, if there is a goal of BlackRock, what is it?
I love where you're going here, and I'm going to go two different directions with it. And first, the goal of BlackRock, it's hard to say. Larry Fink is very good at his job, extremely good at his job. And Vanguard is notoriously good at obfuscating who's actually calling the shots there. As in, they say that like the funds own and so anyways, it's like, it is hard to get a concrete answer as to like, is this intentional? Mm-hmm. And the best you can do is sort of look at what they're doing across the world, like what they're doing in Ukraine to fund and so, make your own judgments. But I think the more interesting part of your question is, although I might back up for a second and say, even if BlackRock doesn't have a goal, I can't imagine that the financial institutions and the members of the big club that you're not in have any problem with this voting rights thing that I just described. Like, regardless of whether it's intentional or not, the outcome benefits them all. So they're all incentivized to keep that going.
Yeah.
But I think the really interesting part of this is sort of back to this: is there this shadowy cabal of guys sitting around a table deciding how the world runs? Or is it, what's the phrase that you
meta fraud?
A meta fraud. That's so good. I'm going to remember that. And I like to take it out of the place where we're like being contentious about it. Like, no, there's no cabal controlling the world today. It's like, whatever. I don't care. Yeah. Let's rewind somewhere in history where we have a little more clarity and unpack it as an example. And the Iraq War is a perfect example. Dick Cheney, as our vice president, as, a representative of Halliburton, as an author of not exactly an author, but as a member of PNAC and a key architect of the Iraq War, we know full well at this point that several of the people deep in the Bush administration very much knew that the intelligence on WMDs were absolute outright lies at the time that they were being pitched to us. We knew that. We know it now. At the time, we were being fooled. And we know that some of those really high level people knew that they were for sure lies. But George Bush might have just been dumb enough to get used by his buddies that were way more savvy than him. Like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney had been around since George Bush Sr. And George Bush Sr. was a full-on CIA operative. And there's a whole other rabbit hole about him doing like these secret dark things in the Vietnam era before he became the CIA director. That is a whole other rabbit. So his daddy, HW, was good at his job. And Rumsfeld and Cheney were back in that day, and they're the old hats. And it's hard not to see them getting appointed as W's handlers. And so when you look at W, it's like maybe he knew how fraudulent they were being, but maybe he was just a useful idiot. And then you move down the chain and you think about all the journalists that parroted those lines. It's like, did they really know what they were doing, or were they just manipulable? And when you create narratives that are believable enough and that are palatable enough and that have the ability to be sold as like either the greater good or for America or for the safety of civilians or democracy, those kinds of things are things that you can rally, sorry guys, the useful idiots around. I'm just talking about Iraq War. I'm not talking about right now. But that's where you start to realize, like, I think that people often like want that simple answer of there's like 12 families that rule the world, and like maybe, but I don't really care either way, because the more you kind of like look down the line at the people that are actually engaging in the fraud in our media spaces, in our political spaces, our financial spaces, Some of them know what they're doing,
Yeah.
but not all of them. And some people are smart enough to conspire to do great things for good or for evil, like, because that's just how humans collaborate to do things. Like, if you want to start a cool podcast, you got to work with some cool people to make a podcast happen. And if you want to, you know, make a giant financial bubble based on fraudulent housing market and then pop it and, you know, run off with a whole bailout, you got to get with some pretty great people in order to do it. And it wouldn't hurt for that to be like the guys that run the Fed and run the banks and run the government, and then bring in a president that is willing to put all of your guys into his cabinet, which is a whole other rabbit hole. So I love unpacking that layer of like, no, I don't personally think that it is like a table of people deciding the fate of the world.
Yeah.
I think there are tables of people that are exerting massive amounts of influence to their interests, and identifying those tables, so to speak, those metaphorical tables of powerful interests, like the Federal Reserve System, like the sort of defense contractor, international war machine system, the big pharma lobbies. Identifying those really helps you clear up the media space and the information space to understand better what's going on.
Yeah, it goes back to something you said way earlier, right? Like looking to see who is invested in which outcome, right? Which is maybe another way of saying follow the money, right? Exactly. It's like it just, because ultimately, I mean, not that people always do what's in their financial best interest, but generally, right? If you have to paint it in the broadest strokes, like that's a pretty reliable, I mean, not as reliable as maybe, you know, gravity, but damn, it's pretty close, right? Like broad strokes, if you have to guess what someone's going to do, well, it's Darwinian, right? They're acting in a way that optimizes their self-preservation, right? So, yeah, it seems like a very useful way to a useful lens, let's say, to look at the world through, rather than trying to, you know, understand these stories that are fed to us. It's like, you brought up the Iraq war. It's a great one. It's like, you know, they have weapons of mass destruction. Here's 10,000 pages of reports that verify that. It's like, you can't even get through this information. And then the information, it's like, you talk about tracing it to source. It's like a lot of it's redacted, and it's like, you're just, I don't know. It's a fool's errand. You'll just never get to the bottom of that.
And it's designed to be one.
And it's designed because it's a distraction, right? But if you just look like, wait, who's getting paid here, right? Like, why is this 100%. Even called the Iraq War? First of all, it's like, it's not even a war. We're just invading a country.
Had nothing to do with 9/11.
No, had nothing to do with that.
No. Well, they tried to make it have something to do with 9/11 by creating this anthrax scare and sending out a whole bunch of anthrax to conveniently all the people that were opposed to the Iraq War, plus some fake anthrax to the other ones to throw off the trail. And then that anthrax traced back to a CIA lab as the only place it could be produced when we actually got the facts later on. So I think that it blows my mind how many journalists on Twitter today have such a short memory to be able to kind of generally, we all agree that that is what happened during the Iraq War. And then to see what happened in Ukraine and not ask any questions, to see what's happened with Israel and Gaza and not ask very many questions, and to see what's about to happen with Iran and not ask too many questions. And it just blows my mind. Like, I have yet to find a war that was not started by political scheming and fake news, essentially, dating all the way back to like kind of World War II, but kind of beyond that, even like kind of World War I, maybe beyond that. It's real hard to do.
Yeah, I mean,
all wars are bankers' wars.
Yeah, and I was going to go to Sun Tzu. He said all warfare is based on deception. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.